Bonjour! Today we're going to be looking at irregular verbs in the present tense. Recapping the last video, we learnt that forming the present tense in French involves removing the last two letters of an infinitive and adding these endings. So we have the ER infinitives, the IR infinitives, and the RE infinitives. However, there are some exceptions to this rule. Not all French verbs can be put into the present tense by this process. They follow their own pattern. They do not take these endings and instead have their own parts. We therefore call them irregular verbs. Here are some examples. Être, to be. Avoir, to have. Aller, to go. Savoir, to know. Devoir, to have to. Pouvoir, to be able to. Vouloir, to want. And faire, to do. Être, avoir, faire and aller, however, are arguably the most important irregular verbs in French. This is for two reasons. One being that they are used to make other French tenses which you will encounter later on, and also because you'll find yourself needing to use them very often. It's therefore essential that you learn these verbs in particular. Okay, let's take a look at être. This means to be, and here you can see it conjugates to je suis, tu es, il, elle, on, est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils, elles sont. And you can see the meanings for it here. You will have certainly used this verb before when describing yourself. It's very, very common and also very irregular. It's important that you learn its parts by reciting in your head out loud, suis, est, sommes, et sont. Repeatedly build up a rhythm, reciting those parts constantly until you learn them. And you should do this for all of these verbs. The second verb is avoir, to have. Here we have je, ai, tu, as, il, elles, on, a, nous avons, vous avez, ils, elles, ont. Again, you may have used it when describing your age, as in French, age is described by saying how many years you have, not how many years you are. Note that with je, it becomes j'ai, as in French. When you're using je, and its verb part begins with a vowel, you would use an apostrophe to help it flow better. So je ai becomes j'ai, it sounds better. Faire is another one. Here we have je fais, tu fais, ils, elles ont fait, nous faisons, vous faites, ils, elles font. And you can see the meanings for it here. Perhaps you would be using faire to say what activities you do. For example, you would say je fais du vélo. Finally, we have aller, another equally important verb. We have je vais, tu vas, il, elle, on va, nous allons, vous allez, ils, elles vont. And here are its meanings. One thing I personally like to identify in languages is patterns and links, as it helps me remember things more easily. Here we have the four verbs I just mentioned. Can you spot any similarities between them? Here are just a few. You'll notice that for tu, for example, the verb part ends in s, and this is true for almost all verbs in French, be it regular verbs or irregular verbs. And for il/elle, the verb part ends in on for all of them. It's important to identify these links as it makes learning so much more easier. Let's put this into practice and see if you can translate these four into French. Pause the video and have a go. Okay, I have, that would be tu as from the verb avoir. You, plural are, vous êtes from the verb être. Do not forget the accent on the e. They, masculine, go, ils vont. She is, elle est. There are many other irregular verbs, including these four, which are quite important in French. These verbs are in fact called modal verbs, and I will release a video on them in the future as they are very useful in expressing certain things. We have pouvoir, vouloir, devoir, savoir. I would recommend that you learn these also. Memorise the parts as you would with all the other verbs. Okay, to recap what we've learnt. There's a group of verbs that do not follow the usual rule to conjugate them in the present tense, and we call these irregular verbs. These irregular verbs have their own pattern, which can be very different to what you would normally expect. These parts must be learned. The four most important verbs are être, faire, aller and avoir, and they play a very important role in French.